There are insults. And then there are the kinds of insults that are so precisely, so surgically constructed to hit the deepest possible nerve that they stop being just words and become something closer to a declaration of war. The kind of thing that, once said out loud in a room, cannot be unsaid, cannot be walked back, cannot be diplomatically smoothed over with a handshake and a change of subject. The kind of thing that hangs in the air like smoke after a gunshot and makes every single person present go absolutely, completely, breathlessly still, because every person in that room understands, in the same instant, that what was just said has changed the temperature of everything, and that whoever responds next is going to define what happens for a long time afterward. Now, I want you to picture the scene. It is 1945, somewhere in the rubble and ruin of defeated Germany, in some commandeered building that still smells faintly of the war that just finished tearing the world apart. A group of captured German soldiers, not random foot soldiers, not scared teenagers who got drafted in the final desperate months of the Reich, but seasoned, experienced, professional Wehrmacht men who have been fighting since Poland, since France, since the Eastern Front, are sitting across from American officers as part of the routine processing and interrogation that followed Germany's surrender. And one of these captured Germans, emboldened perhaps by the particular brand of arrogance that never quite died even in the ruins of everything the Third Reich had built and lost, looks across that table at the American officers sitting opposite him and says something that lands in the room like a grenade with the pin already pulled. He says that the British Army was the muscle of the Allied war effort, the real fighting force, the backbone, the professional, battle-hardened, tradition-carrying spine of everything that defeated Nazi Germany. And the Americans? The Americans, he says, with the particular kind of contemptuous calm that is somehow worse than shouting, were just the fat wallet, the checkbook, the industrial piggy bank that funded the real soldiers while sitting safely behind an ocean, counting its money and waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before deciding it was safe enough to get involved. The fat wallet. Those two words, applied to the United States of America, to the country that had sent its sons, its factory workers and farmers and college students and corner store owners across that ocean, to fight and bleed and die on beaches and in forests and in frozen fields across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany itself. The fat wallet applied to the American GI who had survived Kasserine and came back harder, who had stormed Omaha Beach into the teeth of German machine gun fire, who had held Bastogne in the middle of a Belgian winter so brutal it froze the grease in rifle mechanisms, surrounded, outgunned, outnumbered, and reportedly told his German encirclers to nuts when they demanded his surrender. Applied to those men, in front of George S. Patton. Now here is the thing about this moment that most people, even serious World War II history fans, who have read the books and watched the documentaries and can name the major battles and commanders without blinking, don't fully appreciate. This was not the first time Patton had heard some version of this argument. It was not the first time the question of relative Allied contributions had been raised in ways designed to diminish what American soldiers had accomplished. He had heard it from Soviet officers who claimed the Red Army had won the war essentially alone. He had heard it from German generals who said the real war was fought on the Eastern Front, and the Western campaign was a sideshow. He had heard versions of it from within the Allied command structure itself, from the friction and rivalry between American and British commanders that ran like a fault line beneath the surface of Allied unity from North Africa all the way to Berlin. But this version, the fat wallet version, the idea that America's contribution was fundamentally financial rather than military, that the British were the warriors and the Americans were the bankers of the alliance, this one hit differently. Because it wasn't just an argument about strategy or scale or military precedence. It was an argument about identity, about what America was, about what the American soldier was made of, about whether the boys who crossed that ocean and gave everything they had, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, but literally, physically, with their bodies and their blood and their youth, and in hundreds of thousands of cases their lives were warriors or were just well-funded auxiliaries, propping up the real fighting force of the British Empire. And George Patton, the man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for war, studying war, living war, breathing war, who believed with a religious intensity that bordered on mystical that he had been a warrior in previous lives and would be again, who had driven his Third Army across more ground against more resistance in less time than almost any comparable force in the history of mechanized warfare. George Patton was not going to let that argument stand in any room he was breathing in. What he said in response to those captured Germans, the specific, devastating, historically grounded, deeply personal answer he delivered to the fat wallet insult, is a story that deserves to be told in full. And tonight we are going to tell every inch of it. But before we go there, and I promise you this story is going to be different from anything you have heard before, I need you to do something for me right now. Drop your location in the comments below. Your city, your state, wherever in this world you are watching from tonight. Because the community on this channel is something real and I genuinely want to know who is in the room with me. And if you are new here, welcome home. Seriously. Because this is where history gets told the way it actually deserves to be told. Raw, dramatic, real. No sanitizing, no footnote burying, no textbook version that files off all the edges. Just the truth of what happened when extraordinary men faced extraordinary moments. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we drop stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Like this video if you are already feeling that particular kind of fired up energy that only real history can produce. And tell me in the comments, do you think the fat wallet argument has any historical legitimacy? Do you think America's contribution to World War II gets the respect it deserves in the broader historical narrative? Or do you think the British perspective on Allied contributions has been allowed to dominate the story in ways that aren't entirely fair to what American soldiers actually accomplished? Give me your honest, unfiltered take right now, because that is exactly the kind of debate this community was built for. Now let's go. Because to understand what Patton said in that room, you first need to understand where that fat wallet argument came from, how it was built, why it had enough surface credibility to be said out loud by a captured German soldier in front of American officers, and why it contained just enough complicated historical truth to make it genuinely dangerous rather than simply dismissible. And that requires us to go back, all the way back to the beginning of the war, to 1939, to the years when Britain was bleeding and America was watching, and the argument about who was really carrying the alliance had not yet been settled by the blood and sacrifice that would eventually settle it beyond any serious dispute. Stay with me, because we are just getting started, and this story goes somewhere that is going to make you feel things that are very hard to name, but very impossible to forget. To understand why that fat wallet insult landed with the particular weight that it did, why it was not simply dismissed as the bitter grumbling of a defeated enemy, but actually required a serious, substantive, historically grounded response, you have to understand the complicated, uncomfortable, genuinely messy reality of how the Allied partnership between Britain and America actually developed over the course of the Second World War. Because the truth of it is not the clean, unified, we were always in this together narrative that post-war mythology prefers. The truth of it is considerably more complicated than that. And the complications began in September of 1939. When Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, the United States did absolutely nothing of a military nature. Nothing. America watched. America debated. America had a powerful, vocal, well-organized isolationist movement led by men like Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, whose America First organization argued with genuine conviction and considerable public support that Europe's wars were Europe's problems, and that American boys had no business dying on foreign soil for foreign quarrels that had nothing to do with the fundamental interests of the United States. And for more than 2 years during which Britain stood alone after the fall of France in June 1940. 2 years during which the Royal Air Force fought the Battle of Britain in the summer skies over England and kept the German invasion at bay through a combination of extraordinary courage and almost impossibly narrow margins. 2 years during which British cities were bombed night after night in the Blitz while ordinary British civilians slept in underground stations and emerged each morning to find their neighborhoods altered beyond recognition. For all of those 2 years, America remained officially neutral. Now, to be fair, and this story requires fairness even when fairness is uncomfortable, America was not doing nothing during those 2 years. The Lend-Lease program, which Roosevelt pushed through Congress in March of 1941, was sending enormous quantities of American military equipment to Britain: destroyers, aircraft, weapons, ammunition, food on terms that amounted to an undeclared economic alliance that was about as unneutral as it was possible to be without actually putting American soldiers on a battlefield. And that material support was genuinely, critically important to Britain's ability to keep fighting during those darkest years, when it stood essentially alone against the full military and industrial weight of Nazi-controlled Europe. But here is the thing, and this is the thing that the captured Germans in that room in 1945 were pointing at when they constructed their fat wallet argument. Lend-Lease was financial. It was industrial. It was the output of American factories and American farms and American shipyards, channeled across the Atlantic to sustain a fighting force that was not American. The men doing the actual bleeding during those 2 years were British and Commonwealth Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, fighting under British command across North Africa, and in the Atlantic, and in the skies over Europe. But not Americans. Not yet. Not until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor settled the American isolationist debate with the particular finality that only a direct military attack on American soil can produce. And even after Pearl Harbor, even after America was formally in the war, the British perspective on the American military contribution was, in the early years, genuinely complicated by the performance of American forces in their first major engagements. Because here is a fact that American popular history tends to move past quickly, and that the captured Germans in that room were absolutely aware of the American military's first major ground engagement against German forces in World War II was, by any honest assessment, a disaster. Kasserine Pass, February 1943. Tunisia, the German Afrika Korps under Rommel's command, hit green American forces in the dorsal mountains of Tunisia and drove them back 50 miles in 2 days of fighting that exposed fundamental deficiencies in American training, leadership, equipment, and tactical doctrine that shocked Allied commanders and temporarily seemed to confirm every European assumption about American military unreadiness. The British reaction to Kasserine, both at the command level and among ordinary British soldiers and civilians, was not kind. There was a genuine, documented, historically recorded tendency in British military circles after Kasserine to view American forces as enthusiastic amateurs who had the equipment and the numbers, but lacked the professional military competence that came from real combat experience. British commanders like Harold Alexander, who commanded both British and American ground forces in Tunisia, wrote reports after Kasserine that were diplomatically phrased, but whose essential message was that American troops required close supervision and could not yet be trusted to operate independently against first-rate German opposition. And that attitude, that particular brand of quietly condescending British military professionalism that had been built on 2 centuries of imperial warfare across every continent on Earth, and that had a tendency to view newer military establishments with a mixture of patronizing encouragement and genuine doubt, persisted in British military culture long after American forces had actually proven themselves capable of a great deal more than Kasserine suggested. So when those captured Germans sat in that room in 1945 and said that the British were the muscle and the Americans were the fat wallet, they were not making up an argument from scratch. They were taking an argument that had genuine roots in the complicated early history of the Anglo-American alliance, in the 2 years of British sacrifice before America entered the war, in the painful early performance of American forces at Kasserine, in the real and documented tensions between British and American commanders over questions of military competence and operational authority, and they were weaponizing it, sharpening it, pointing it directly at the American officers across the table, with the particular cruelty of men who had nothing left to lose, and had decided that if they were going down, they were going to say every uncomfortable true-ish thing they had been holding on to for the preceding years of fighting. And it was working, not in the sense that the Americans in that room were convinced not for a single second, but in the sense that the argument had enough surface validity, enough historical texture, enough real-world complication to it that a simple dismissal was not going to cut it. A simple, "You are wrong, and we won," and that is not going to adequately answer what had just been said. And that is precisely why it was George Patton's response, and not just any response, but the specific, layered, operationally detailed, personally passionate response that Patton delivered in that room that matters so much historically. Because Patton understood something that the captured Germans had not accounted for when they constructed their argument. They had built their case in the early years of the war, in 1939 and 1940 and 1941 and early 1942 and early 1943, the years of British sacrifice and American absence and American stumbling. What they had not adequately weighted, what their argument essentially erased or minimized, was everything that happened after Kasserine. Everything that happened in the 2 years between that February disaster in Tunisia and the moment Germany surrendered in May of 1945. And Patton knew that everything was better than any man alive, because he had been there for almost all of it. He had been in Tunisia in the immediate aftermath of Kasserine, brought in specifically to fix what had gone wrong, to retrain and reorient and reignite American forces in a way that would prevent anything like Kasserine from happening again. He had driven American forces across Sicily in 38 days, in a campaign that covered more ground faster than any comparable Allied operation in the Mediterranean theater. He had commanded the Third Army in its breakout from Normandy, and its drive across France, one of the most rapid and sustained armored advances in the history of mechanized warfare. He had turned that army 90 degrees in the middle of a brutal winter and driven it 60 miles through ice and snow to relieve the surrounded Americans at Bastogne. He had crossed the Rhine. He had driven into the heart of Germany itself. He had done all of this, and he was not for 1 second, not in any room he was breathing in, going to sit across from captured Germans and allow the fat wallet narrative to stand as the final word on what America and American soldiers had contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. He leaned forward, and he began to speak, and what came out of his mouth in the next several minutes was not an explosion. It was not the theatrical, profanity-loaded performance that was the Patton of popular legend. It was something considerably more dangerous than that. It was a systematic, methodical, historically precise demolition of every single brick in the argument those Germans had just constructed, starting with the first brick, starting with the money, because Patton had something specific and devastating to say about the fat wallet accusation that nobody in that room saw coming. And once he said it, the entire foundation of the German argument began to crack in a way that could not be repaired. Stay with me, because what happens next is the part of this story that changes everything. Patton started with the money. Not defensively, not apologetically, not with the tone of a man who has been caught doing something he is slightly embarrassed about and is trying to reframe it in the most flattering light possible. He started with the money the way a prosecutor starts with the most damning piece of evidence deliberately, confidently, because he knew that what looked like his weakest point was actually, when examined honestly and completely, one of his strongest. He told those captured Germans, and the room was absolutely still, every American officer present leaning slightly forward, every captured German suddenly very aware that the temperature in the room had changed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside, that yes, America had money. America had factories. America had industrial output on a scale that the world had never seen before and has arguably never seen since. And he asked them quietly, in that precise, controlled voice that was more frightening than shouting what they thought that money had actually purchased. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of economics or geopolitics or grand alliance strategy, in specific, concrete, operationally documented military terms. What had the American industrial machine actually produced and delivered to the battlefield? And what had that production actually meant for the outcome of the war that those Germans had just finished losing? He started with the numbers that most people, even most serious students of World War II history, have never fully sat with long enough for them to actually land with their true weight. The United States, between 1941 and 1945, produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft. Let that register for a moment. 300,000. Germany produced somewhere around 119,000 over the entire course of the war. The United States produced 86,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. It produced 2.5 million military trucks. It produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It built 2,710 Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that carried the material of war across the Atlantic in quantities that the German U-boat campaign, devastating as it was, could never fully interdict. And here is the piece that Patton zeroed in on with particular precision, the piece that cut directly to the heart of the fat wallet argument and exposed the fundamental dishonesty at its core. A significant and critical portion of that American industrial output did not go to American forces. It went to Britain. It went to the Soviet Union. It went to every allied nation that was fighting the war in the years before American soldiers were on the ground in significant numbers. The Lend-Lease program sent $50 billion worth of military equipment and supplies to allied nations over the course of the war, approximately $11 billion of that to Britain specifically. And Patton said something about that fact that reframed the entire fat wallet argument in a way that was so simple and so devastating that it was almost beautiful in its precision. He said that calling America the fat wallet of the alliance was like calling the man who built the gun, loaded it, maintained it, and handed it to the shooter, and then went and fought with his own rifle, simultaneously a mere financial contributor to the battle. The British Army that the captured Germans were praising as the muscle of the alliance had fought with American equipment, American ammunition, American food, American fuel, and American logistical support from the very early years of the war. The American Sherman tanks that equipped British armored divisions in North Africa, the American trucks that moved British supplies across the Western Desert, the American canned rations that fed British soldiers during the long campaigns in the Mediterranean. The fat wallet had not simply written a check and stepped back. It had written the check and shown up to fight. And Patton was not finished. Not even close. Because the industrial argument, devastating as it was only the first layer of what he was building. He moved smoothly, methodically, like a man working through a brief he has prepared with absolute thoroughness to the operational record. The actual battlefield performance of American forces from the moment they entered the war to the moment those captured Germans had found themselves sitting across a table from him in a defeated country. And he started with a deliberateness that made several of the captured Germans shift uncomfortably in their seats. At Kasserine. He did not avoid it. He did not skip past it, or minimize it, or pretend it had not happened. Because Patton understood something fundamental about the nature of genuine military argument that the captured Germans had not anticipated. That a man who acknowledges his own side's failures honestly and specifically is vastly more credible when he then proceeds to dismantle your argument than a man who simply denies that any failures occurred. So he talked about Kasserine. He talked about what had gone wrong and why. He talked about the green American troops who had been thrown against battle-hardened German veterans without adequate preparation, without sufficient combined arms integration, without the tactical experience that only actual combat can produce. He acknowledged that Kasserine was a genuine military failure, a painful one, an instructive one. And then he asked those captured Germans a question that nobody in that room saw coming. He asked them what had happened to the American forces that fought at Kasserine in the 2 years that followed that defeat. He answered his own question before they could respond. Those same forces retrained, reorganized, led by new commanders, incorporating the brutal lessons of their defeat into every subsequent operation, had driven Rommel's Afrika Korps into the sea in Tunisia by May of 1943. 3 months after Kasserine. 3 months. The same American soldiers who had been broken and driven back at Kasserine had come back and finished the job in North Africa in 3 months. And then Patton walked them through what came next. Sicily. The American 7th Army's campaign across Sicily in 38 days, covering more ground faster than any comparable Allied operation in the Mediterranean theater, outrunning even Patton's own optimistic projections, demonstrating a rate of operational advance that left German and Italian defenders scrambling to respond. He talked about the specific engagements, the fight for Troina, which German commanders later acknowledged as one of the most tenacious and professionally executed American infantry battles of the Mediterranean campaign. He talked about the crossing of the Salso River under fire. He talked about the capture of Palermo, which Patton's forces reached ahead of schedule through a combination of aggressive leadership and the particular American military quality that he would return to again and again throughout his response, the ability to improvise, adapt, and accelerate when the situation demanded it, rather than defaulting to the methodical, step-by-step operational caution that characterized the British approach under Montgomery. And then he moved to France, to the breakout from Normandy in late July and August of 1944 Operation Cobra and the subsequent exploitation that unleashed the Third Army into the open country of France and transformed the campaign from a grinding, attritional struggle in the Norman hedgerows into one of the most dramatic armored advances in the history of mechanized warfare. He talked about the numbers. In the weeks following the Normandy breakout, the Third Army advanced at a rate that covered more ground per day than any armored force had managed on the Western Front in either World War. They crossed the Loire. They crossed the Seine. They drove toward the German border at a pace that was consuming fuel faster than the Allied supply system could deliver it, which led directly to one of the most consequential and most bitterly contested decisions of the entire Western campaign, when Allied Supreme Commander Eisenhower redirected fuel supplies away from Patton's advancing Third Army to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Patton's advance was stopped not by German resistance. The German forces in front of him were in no condition to stop him, but by the absence of gasoline. His tanks literally ran dry. And Patton said something about that moment, about the halt imposed on the Third Army by the fuel shortage in September of 1944, that landed in that room with the particular weight of a man saying something he has believed for a long time and has finally found the right audience for. He said that if the Third Army had been given the fuel it needed in September of 1944, instead of having those resources redirected to support a British-led operation that subsequently failed Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault into the Netherlands that ended in the disaster at Arnhem, the bridge too far, the war in Europe might have ended months earlier. Those American boys who died in the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, boys who froze to death in the forests of the Ardennes, who were killed at Normandy, who held Bastogne against everything the Wehrmacht could throw at them, might have lived, because the war might already have been over. He said that without raising his voice, without theatrical emphasis, just stated it as the operational assessment of a military professional who had been there and who had watched the consequences of that decision play out in real time in the blood and sacrifice of his own soldiers. And the room, already very quiet, went quieter, because everyone present, American and German alike, understood that what Patton had just said was not the angry complaint of a man nursing a personal grievance. It was the documented, operationally grounded judgment of the commander who had driven the Third Army from Normandy to the German border, and who had watched his momentum sacrificed on the altar of alliance politics and British operational priority. And then Patton delivered the final piece, the piece that brought everything together and answered the fat wallet. Insult not just with statistics and operational history, but with something more personal, more direct, and more unanswerable than either. He talked about the American soldier, not as a category, not as a demographic or a military designation, as a specific, individual, irreplaceable human being who had come from somewhere real and given something that could never be returned. He talked about the boys from Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania and California who had shown up in Europe without the centuries of military tradition that the British soldier carried, without the professional military culture that had been built into the German soldier from adolescence, without anything except their training and their courage, and that particular American quality: restless, improvisational, stubbornly individualistic, deeply reluctant to accept that something cannot be done, that had made them, over the course of 2 years of combat, into something that no military establishment in the world had quite seen before. He said the American soldier was not a product of military tradition. He was a product of American life, of the same culture that had built the factories producing those 300,000 aircraft and those 86,000 tanks. The same culture of problem-solving and improvisation and refusal to accept limitations that had industrialized a continent in a generation and built the most productive economy in human history. That culture, Patton said, did not produce soldiers who fought because they had been trained from birth to fight, or because a political officer behind them would shoot them if they ran. It produced soldiers who fought because they had decided individually, personally, with the stubborn American conviction that their decision was the right one, that what they were fighting for was worth fighting for. And soldiers who fight by choice, Patton told those captured Germans, fight differently than soldiers who fight by compulsion. They fight with initiative. They fight with creativity. They fight with the particular dangerous quality of men who have been trusted to make decisions and who have internalized that trust into something that functions even when the command structure breaks down, when the officers are dead, when the plan has made contact with reality and dissolved. He asked those captured Germans, and this was the question that finally, completely, irreversibly broke the fat wallet argument into pieces that could not be reassembled: which army, at the end of the war, was still advancing? Which army had driven from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany in less than a year? Which army had crossed the Rhine and kept going? Which army was, at the moment of Germany's surrender, still moving forward with its operational cohesion intact, its fighting spirit undiminished, its soldiers tired, yes, but unbroken and undefeated, ready to keep going as long as going was required? It was not a rhetorical question. The answer was sitting in the room in the form of every American officer present, and the captured Germans, those men who had walked into that room carrying the fat wallet argument like a weapon, who had delivered it with the calm, contemptuous authority of men who believed they were saying something that the historical record supported, had nothing left to say. Not because they had been shouted down or intimidated into silence, but because the argument had been met on its own terms historically, operationally, specifically, and had been found to be exactly what it was. Not a serious military assessment, not an honest accounting of what the alliance had been and what each partner had contributed to its ultimate victory, but a defensive mythology, a story that defeated men tell themselves to preserve some fragment of dignity in the wreckage of everything they fought for and lost. A way of saying we were beaten by someone worthy of beating us, rather than confronting the full, unmediated, completely unanswerable truth that the army sitting across from them, the army that had been called the Fat Wallet, had shown up, had learned, had adapted, had driven across a continent, and had arrived at this moment of total German defeat, not as a supporting actor in someone else's story, but as a central, essential, irreplaceable force in the greatest military coalition in the history of human civilization. That was what Patton said. That was the answer to the Fat Wallet. And it stands 8 decades later, in every honest accounting of what the Second World War was, and how it was won, as true today as it was in that room in 1945. Drop that in the comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me whether you believe the American military contribution to World War II gets the respect and the honest historical accounting that it deserves. Tell me whether the Fat Wallet argument is something you have encountered before, in a classroom, in a documentary, in a conversation, with someone who had a different perspective on Allied contributions. Because this community is the place where those conversations happen honestly, and without the sanitizing filter of politically convenient historical narrative. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because these are the men, and these are the moments that built the world we are living in right now. And on this channel we tell their story straight, every single time, without apology, without flinching, and without ever, not for one single second, letting the Fat Wallet narrative be the last word on what American soldiers accomplished in the greatest war in human history.